This is the BBC.
This week's File on 4 speaks to families in the UK on the brink of adoption breakdown. We hear from parents struggling to keep their families together and those who say they had no choice but to send their child back into care. The reporter is Aylis Hart.
Take it or leave it, make a change and you might just believe it. It's like a phrase, nothing clarity. Might get you somewhere then living on the street. But yeah, that's it.
You do know your mum knows all the lyrics.
Yeah, I know that.
No, it's good, isn't it?
Jenny is 16. She writes and performs rap music, and her lyrics are about her experience of adoption.
Yeah, that was the one that I wrote about my mum. Not you.
No, yeah.
I remember looking down in life, what's it all worth? My mum walked away and disappeared off the earth. What a way to start knowing I was so unwanted. Drugs in my system and she better be disappointed. I wasn't the one that walked away and didn't even look back and stay with me for one day. True colours of a human being that can go that low and carry on with their life like I was unknown. And that's really it.
And that's about your birth mum?
Yeah, that's how I feel about the situation as well. So, but yeah, that's the start of it.
Elaine adopted Jenny when she was born, straight from hospital. She spent the first 3 months of her life in intensive care, withdrawing from the drugs her birth mother used when she was pregnant. For privacy, we've changed their first names.
It was an exceptionally long withdrawal period. She was addicted to various drugs. Mainly methadone was known about, but there were other drugs, street heroin and all sorts of cocaine. I think alcohol as well was quite a feature.
Bringing Jenny up hasn't been easy. She's good fun, creative and enthusiastic about life. But from an early age, she was hard to control, aggressive even. And with adolescence, things got worse.
We've been in crisis for 4 years, more or less, since the age of 12. After the transition to secondary school, it became impossible, really. She was overwhelmed. It was a large school. That experience just blew her apart, and the school were not able to cope with her. They excluded her.
What were things like at home?
Terrible, absolutely terrible. When she was put in the seclusion unit, she started to meet other troubled girls. So everything snowballed, really. The running away started. We just wouldn't know where she was. And she would turn her phone off, which was terrible. And then I was forced to call the police and report her missing. There was worries about gang involvement. Some of the girls were involved in gangs.
Elaine's background is in social work, so she's pretty much seen it all, but says her professional training still didn't equip her for the challenges at home. The adoption has broken down more than once, which meant Jenny was sent to foster care.
Because you come out of the care system and it was the last thing you'd ever want, and that's what we'd been fighting against all the years, really. I think we were living with placement breakdown from when she was 6, if I'm honest with you. In another family, I think it would have broken down at 6. So we were on borrowed time.
In Britain, around 5,500 kids are adopted every year. But Elaine and Jenny aren't the only families struggling. File on 4 conducted a survey with leading charity Adoption UK. Almost 3,000 adopters responded, and whilst it's just a snapshot and not a representative sample, the headline results are revealing. When asked how they would describe their adoption, more than a quarter of families told us they were in crisis. That's to say, they were facing serious challenges that impact on other members of the family, that their adoption is at risk of breakdown or disruption, or that it had already disrupted. The challenges facing adopters today are very different from 30 years ago. Sue Armstrong-Brown is from Adoption UK.
Children now that are coming into adoptive families often have experienced trauma, and that can be neglect, it can be abuse, physical, mental or even sexual abuse. They can have been exposed to drugs or alcohol in the womb. They can have witnessed a lot of chaos in their lives, and that really has a strong impact on the way their brains develop. The world is a terrifying and unpredictable place, and they react accordingly. That isn't to say that all adoptive families end up in these very difficult situations. Many adoptive placements are very little different from a birth family. So there is a spectrum there.
When we are doing our assessments of children after the kind of background that your son has had of very early neglect, some maltreatment, we are trying to understand the developmental and psychological consequences of those early experiences on later development. And they are complex.
Professor Jonathan Green is a consultant at Royal Manchester Children's Hospital. He runs a specialist clinic for children with social and developmental problems, and many of his patients are adopted. Today he's meeting with the adoptive parents of a little boy whose difficult start in life has left him with serious gaps in his early development.
It is hard to hear that. It's hard to hear the impact of early years on his life. It really is very difficult to hear. I guess for us, though, in the future, how do you specifically target those gaps to ensure that he can catch up developmentally?
Really, the first thing is to identify what those gaps are.
The mix of abuse and neglect with drinking and drug taking during pregnancy means many adopted children can have a range of complex difficulties.
Around about 70% of children after adoption present with significant mental health problems of one kind or another. Rates of what we call neurodevelopmental disorders are greatly increased in this group. We've done a number of studies in this area, but one particular one with adoption we found was a relatively very high proportion of them had autistic spectrum disorder, so about 12%. And another good proportion had a high level of ADHD and other kinds of problem that we call attachment disorder, which is another developmental difficulty associated with early disrupted care. And we also found a high burden in these children of other kinds of emotional and behavioural difficulties generally. And a lot of these developmental problems are enduring.
For parents who deal with the fallout of these problems, family life can be extremely difficult.
Patrick has a great sense of humour. He loves younger children. He has a fantastic memory for things he's particularly interested in: dinosaurs, cars, animals. But I think from a very young age, Patrick has struggled. When he was 2, he went to his first childminder. She gave notice within 6 weeks because she couldn't cope.
Claire and Peter Morris have 2 birth children. And Patrick, who's almost 10, but who they adopted when he was a toddler. For some obvious reasons and others which will become clear, we've changed their names and voices.
Patrick needs permanent supervision. He'll climb out of windows, he doesn't sleep, he can get aggressive, even violent, to the point we've had to call the police on a couple of times recently.
He's only a little boy and you've had to call the police?
Yeah. Over the past few months, he's got so strong, it's difficult to manage. He's kicked the car window through, smashed the front windscreen. He's broken the shed window twice.
Patrick's early years were tough. Severe neglect and abuse were the norm for him. And so, like some adopted children, he developed an attachment disorder. This means Patrick has difficulty forming relationships and trusting people. He can be disruptive and aggressive and shows little remorse or regret. He's also been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. And as he's getting bigger and stronger, his unpredictable temper and escalating violence are getting harder to take.
He smashed the television recently. The trigger was that he wanted to watch a film at bedtime and we said he couldn't. That's how quickly it escalates. With Patrick, it goes from 0 to 100 miles an hour instantly. So the first reaction is smash something.
Has he ever turned that anger on you?
Yes, he has. He targets different members of the family at various points. At the moment, apart from our youngest, it's pretty indiscriminate.
Are you not worried that someone could get seriously hurt?
Yeah, it has got to that point.
It has got to that point, and it's something we have to face up to. We've reflected on this a lot. The best way of putting it is that some of Patrick's behaviours are like an abusive partner in a domestic violence type of situation. That sounds very strong, but it's hard to describe him in any other way. At one point, our eldest told his grandma he was having nightmares, that he'd wake up and find us dead, that Patrick had killed me and my husband. That's how extreme it feels for him.
That must have been a very difficult thing to hear, to know that he's that frightened of him.
The whole thing has been so hard on him.
But this family is not alone. The results from our survey conducted with Adoption UK are shocking in parts. Almost 2/3 of adopters reported aggression in the home, and more than half reported serious and sustained violence. Their comments make for difficult reading. A good number say they've been punched and kicked and threatened with knives. Destroying property came up quite a lot. But some are even more serious. including injuries that require hospital treatment or sexual assault. Child-to-parent violence is increasingly recognised as a major factor in the breakdown or disruption of adoptions. For the Morris family, it has pushed them to the very brink.
It's become unsustainable. Patrick is our son and we love him, and we are very, in many ways, more protective of him because, in a sense, we know his need is greater. But there is more than just one member of this family. It's had a huge impact on our birth son. The cost to him has been immense. I certainly feel we've got to the point that we could be looking at some kind of breakdown or disruption to the adoption. Obviously, we will do anything that we can to avoid that, but...
We knew that bringing up an adopted child was going to be difficult. We understood that. But to be really blunt about it, we took the local authority at their word when they said that there would be support in place. We didn't realise that getting the help to manage those difficult times would be a struggle itself, and that we'd be fighting for this support at a time when we're probably least able to do it because of what we're dealing with at home.
The family is now battling with the local authority to secure a residential school place for their son.
Without that, I think we will get to the end of the road. Home isn't safe anymore. I desperately want Patrick to stay part of the family, but the local authority have to make that possible. Without that, they're committing kids like our son to failure.
For Sue Armstrong-Brown from Adoption UK, child-on-parent violence has become an all-too-familiar story.
It's been a hidden problem for a very long time, and thankfully it's now being discussed more openly. But I'm not surprised that several of the families that responded said that they had these horrible, horrible situations at home. And of course it puts the adoptive family in a horrific situation. But I think that perhaps it's not that helpful to focus on that side of it because it tends to reinforce this idea of a bad, violent child. That's a traumatised child with a rage trigger because that's the way that they perceive to keep themselves safe. We need to provide the support, the therapy and the help so that they can work through those issues and get out the other side.
While the Morris family are still fighting to get that support, some families say the help they needed never came.
Hi, sorry about the dog.
No worries.
I'm Jane.
Hi Jane, thank you so much.
Just going through keeping the... We first saw her in a catalogue. It's a bit sad really, but we were given a catalogue of hard to place kids, and there she was. She was lovely.
Jane and Keith adopted a little girl from their local authority almost 8 years ago. They both knew it wasn't going to be easy, but they say it became clear early on that their daughter was very troubled. Again, we've changed their names and voices.
She was so distressed when she first came to us. She told us that she didn't like her name, that it was giving her headaches and nightmares, so she changed it. Imagine that. Things started to come to a head when she was 3.5. She'd been developmentally delayed and all the severe behaviour started to come out. She could be lovely one minute and very violent and aggressive the next.
And did you contact the local authority about it?
We did. We had a visiting social worker who came about once a month. The whole time we were saying, we're in trouble, she needs help, we need help, but getting anything was a struggle.
The parents say the local authority were quick to blame them.
They were very keen to question what we might be doing wrong as parents, to turn it on us. There was a lot of finger-pointing going on.
We were loving parents and it felt like we were being treated like we'd caused the damage. I don't think any normal, regular family could meet her needs.
All this time, their daughter's violence was getting worse. And they say what help they did get didn't go anywhere near tackling their daughter's problems.
The only help we got was a guy who did play therapy. I quickly realised that it wasn't working. He told me the longest he'd worked with a child was 12 months, but 15 months in, she was no better. It was clear to us she needed more intensive help, but they didn't have it.
By the time she was 8 years old, the family began to feel overwhelmed, and their daughter's behaviour became even more distressing.
She became obsessed with blood. She was self-harming, and she'd write on the walls with blood. We'd put family photos in her room. She'd take out the plastic glass out of the frame and scratch herself until she bled. She'd pull her own baby teeth out. She refused to go into the bath or brush her teeth, refused to eat or go to bed or have stories read to her. We reached such a stage that our daughter had become unparentable. She'd fight us on every corner. I couldn't cope.
In spring of this year, they made the difficult decision to send their daughter back to care permanently.
In the end, I made the decision and Jane agreed. Jane was more emotional about it, but that's why we work. I think that's why we survived.
The family say they had no other option. After years of battling, they thought this was the only way their daughter would get the help she desperately needed.
If someone had told me how bad it was going to be, I wouldn't have believed them. She's in such turmoil, but her behaviour's not her fault. She needs help from professionals to make sense of what happened to her. You should be able to access that help. I still consider myself to be her mum. I miss her so much. But I couldn't have her in the house. She was destroying our lives.
We wrote to Jane and Keith's local authority and asked them about the lack of support. They wouldn't comment on this case, but they said they provide an extensive range of support and training and are committed to supporting all adoptive families throughout their journey. When adoptions do break down, they say they seek to learn lessons so that children thrive and adopters are supported. I'm on my way to Huddersfield to meet Nigel Priestley. He's a family lawyer who specialises in adoption breakdown and care proceedings. So when families hit crisis point, they often contact him. He's also an adoptive father, so he knows what they're up against.
We find that people say, look, just give us some respite, just give us a break, and we'll keep on, but we've got to have a break from this situation. Respite comes up as a major issue over and over again. People might just want a weekend relaxation from dealing with a very, very challenging child. By and large, local authorities don't come forward with the goods. I think for many adoptive parents, they feel that they've taken on a challenging child and they expect the local authority to work in partnership with them. But instead, they then find they've got badly bruised hands from braying on the door of the local authority and finding that however hard they knock, there's nobody on the other side who's prepared to unlock the door. And that's what leads to adoption breakdown.
The kind of help these families need does exist, but provision is patchy and expensive. Family Futures in North London is an independent, not-for-profit adoption agency that specialises in assessment, treatment and post-adoption support. Alan Burnell is its co-founder.
We offer a multidisciplinary service that's been developed over the last 20 years to really address those developmental needs and to help their adoptive parents or foster carers repair the damage done in early childhood. And if parents aren't properly prepared and supported through the adoption process and given therapeutic help, they will often end up in despair themselves and become traumatised because they don't understand why their child is behaving like they are.
All that costs money. Services like theirs don't come cheap. And not every local authority is prepared to pay. The father on the brink of adoption breakdown is a social worker, so he knows the system inside out. But he says after this experience, he feels his family is being set up to fail.
Local authorities behave like second-hand car dealers when it comes to adoption. You drive off, but then when the problems start, the dealer doesn't want to know. It's all money-driven, in my view. I do think they look at short-term savings over potentially what is in the best interest of kids at that moment. I couldn't advise people to adopt because of the lack of support. I'd say don't do it. Local authorities put up every possible barrier. They're committing kids to failure because of their limited support.
We did want to speak to professionals responsible for adoption about all of these issues. So we contacted the Association of Directors of Children's Services and the Local Government Association, but neither were willing to discuss it. Sue Armstrong-Brown from Adoption UK thinks honesty is the first step towards helping families like these.
We shouldn't be glossing over the difficult bits. We need to talk about the challenges in adoption. It's the only way we're going to get the system to keep developing and improve and get support for the children who need it. And it isn't a conversation that should put adopters off. Families shouldn't be left exposed to these problems and feeling like they have no help. It's absolutely unacceptable that remains the case in many cases.
2 years ago, the Department for Education set up a dedicated fund designed to help families in crisis. The Adoption Support Fund means families can apply for money to pay for specialist therapy, as Alan Burnell from Family Futures explains.
Parents are entitled to apply to their local authority, who then make an application to the Adoption Support Fund. Currently, a local authority can apply for £2,500 for an assessment and £5,000 for some form of treatment.
To some, £5,000 might seem like a fair amount of money, but when you're offering the therapies that you offer here, is it enough?
£5,000 can be enough for some families who need some parenting support or some limited therapeutic help, but for children with complex needs who will have those needs into the future, it isn't enough. If a family are in crisis, if there are no local resources that will meet that family's needs, then there is a contingency fund from the ASF, but that funding has to be matched by the local authority. So the local authority are asked to pay half and the Department of Education will pay the other half. What we've experienced is a reluctance on the part of local authorities to contribute to that match funding.
When the fund was first set up, demand completely outstripped expectations. So last November, they introduced a £5,000 cap, along with a new rule. Any funding above that would have to be matched by the local authority. But we've got hold of the latest figures which show a dramatic drop in applications through local authorities, down from an average of 90 a month before the cap to just 14, which means families in crisis who require therapy above this threshold may not be getting the help they need. For the Morris family, teetering on the brink of adoption breakdown, applying for the money from the fund has been far from easy.
One organisation felt that after an initial assessment, Patrick's behaviour was too challenging for them. It was also a 2-hour drive from home, so it was completely impractical, so that was a non-starter.
But the Adoption Support Fund is held up almost as an emergency relief fund for families just like yours. Have you guys found it any help at all?
Well, overall, it's taken 2 years from our first application to get a suitable service in terms of location and expertise. The recommendation of this agency is we consider disruption or look to full-time boarding with managed family contact, but this hasn't gone down well with the local authority.
Why not?
Because they don't want to pay for it.
Ordinarily, we would ask the local authority for their side of the story. But Patrick's parents are still fighting his corner and they don't want to antagonise the council, so we've agreed to maintain their anonymity. So far, £52 million has been released by the fund since it was set up 2 years ago, reaching 24,000 children. And a further £28 million is earmarked for this financial year. But some experts we've spoken to are concerned about how this money is being spent and how effective the therapy it pays for really is. Professor Jonathan Green sits on the expert panel that advises the Adoption Support Fund. Pull up a chair. He has a breakdown of those receiving money to provide therapy to adopters and their kids.
You'll see the graph here of where the money is going in terms of providers of care.
So what we're looking at is a graph, and there's 5 different categories, but there's one skyscraper of a category where the vast majority of the money is going.
The largest proportion, it's actually 68%, and that's going to independent practitioners commissioned through local authorities. So that's the great bulk of the money is going in that way. Most of them work alone. Some of them are subject to regulation through Ofsted, but many are not at all, and their quality is just vouched for by local authorities who think that they're good. A lot of the therapies that are being used are simply just not evidence, so we just don't know how and if they work at all.
So there's nothing to stop this government money, and it's quite a lot of money. It's £50 million being spent on therapies that just don't work.
That's happening. I think it's an appalling mismatch of resource and attention to need, because we know so much about the complex needs of these children now, and yet the actual resource really isn't going in a way that matches up with that need.
Without any evidence that the therapies work, how can we be sure that it isn't risky or dangerous or that they don't do harm?
Well, we can't be sure of that, and there are 2 kinds of harm. One is that a lot of time is spent on therapies that are wrongly directed to the wrong problem, because there hasn't been an assessment that's really understood what the problem is, and that the child could have been much better managed or helped in a different way. Second thing may be that some of these therapies may intrinsically be risky.
Last month, the government commissioned an independent evaluation of the fund. It revealed that while parents who got the funding said it had improved their lives, the outcomes for children were modest. Alan Burnell from Family Futures also sits on the expert advisory group. He thinks the fund is a welcome step towards recognising the help that these families need, but he's concerned that it's masking a bigger problem.
The danger is that one mistakes palliative care for curative care. I think there's a lot of symptom relief, but we really should be looking at long-term solutions and the trajectory of that child throughout their childhood, not just a short-term fix. Unfortunately, I know it wasn't the intention, but the Adoption Support Fund has spawned a cottage industry of therapists. I'd say they're the good, the bad and the ugly. They're a sort of motley crew. Some are bona fide excellent therapists, but by and large they are not properly supervised, in my view, as they should.
We asked the government department responsible about these concerns. In a statement, the Minister for Children and Families, Robert Goodwill, said that there are strict controls in place for the administration of the fund, which local authorities must adhere to, and the department are determined to ease the transition into adoption through the Adoption Support Fund. We did ask them specifically about the concerns raised about the quality of the therapies, but they didn't respond. The ASF is only available in England, so adopters in Northern Ireland, Scotland or Wales still have to rely on whatever support they can get from their local authority. Stories of adoptions on the verge of breakdown aren't easy to hear. But do families always go into adoption with their eyes open? Earlier this year, 7 years after adopting her, Jane and Keith sent their daughter back to care permanently. A few months later, the couple received a copy of a report. It made for difficult reading.
So it's an assessment carried out by a clinical psychologist looking at her behaviour at home, her behaviour at school, all that. It's part of her new care plan, but really it should have been done years ago. Reading that was quite distressing.
In the report, it said that she had to be removed from her birth family by a police escort, which we weren't told about at the time. There are also allegations that the birth father beat and sexually assaulted the birth mother and beat and burnt our daughter with cigarettes.
Did you know about any of this when you adopted her?
No.
No, we didn't know any of this. Even though we saw her family history, it was very glossed over. And because we hadn't been told everything, we weren't prepared for the issues she had. We were shielded as to what went on or what the father was like. And reading it made me worry maybe she'd witnessed or even been subject to sexual abuse.
When we started the process, they ask you questions. You know, would you consider a child with ... It's called question F. We said no to a child who was a victim of sexual abuse. If we'd been made aware that there were even allegations like this, we wouldn't have gone ahead with it. It's the crux of how I feel about it.
Their local authority wouldn't comment on the individual case, but say they share all the information they have about a child with their prospective adopters prior to placing them with that family. Around a third of adopters who responded to our survey said they believed they didn't receive full and correct information about their child during the adoption process. The reasons for this aren't entirely clear. We spoke to scores of families during our research. Some told us they believe either the social workers underplayed the degree of their child's difficulties, that they didn't understand the significance of them, or that they didn't look hard enough for the information in the first place. Again, we did want to speak to someone responsible about why this was happening, but no one from either the Association of Directors of Children's Services or the local government association was willing to discuss it. Sue Armstrong-Brown from Adoption UK. We have spoken to families who very strongly feel that the wool was pulled over their eyes, that they weren't given full information, that in some cases information was withheld, and they are left with a very troubled child whom they love very much, but for whom they have almost no support.
Very sadly, I'm not surprised by that. We've heard that story many times. We know that there are fantastic working relationships where social workers are absolutely walking in lockstep with adoptive parents, supporting them, giving them all the information. Equally, we do hear these stories that people were not supplied with the information that they should have had, and that's appalling. What we need to see really is a shift to a different relationship between adopters and the state. We're talking about children whose society has failed, and the state should be guaranteeing that these failures will not happen again. There are some children where we know there will be support needs. It should be very clear, and the undertaking between the adoptive family and the state should be recognising that probable support need front and centre. Everybody should be going into this with their eyes open.
Despite the difficulties, the vast majority of those who responded to our survey said they were still glad that they adopted. Back in Manchester, Professor Jonathan Green is piloting a centre of excellence for kids with complex needs. Here, Children's Mental Health Services, the local authority and adoption charities all work together to provide specialist treatment for kids in crisis. But he says in many areas, that's a long way away.
What is truly scandalous about the current situation is that we know very well now the kind of children that are coming into adoptive care. We know a lot scientifically and in terms of treatment about what is going on with these children's developments and what is necessary for treatment. And yet, these parents are often not being properly prepared for the task ahead by understanding what they're going to be faced with. And then they're not being given the appropriate support worthy of their efforts in looking after these children, really on behalf of the community.
It's difficult to know how many adoptions end in disruption. That's because local authorities only keep limited information about what happens to families beyond the first few years, which means little is known about the outcomes for these kids. That's a worry for Lord Justice McFarlane. He sat for years in the Family Division of the High Court, where crucial decisions about care proceedings are heard.
Judges are being asked to make these appallingly difficult decisions, appallingly because the stakes are so high. But there's very little feedback given to the judge in terms of the short-term success and very little research as to whether it works. And I've likened it to someone trying to become proficient at throwing darts, but being told that they have to have their back to the dartboard, have to throw the darts back over their shoulder, and no one tells them whether they're even hitting the wall, let alone the dartboard. We just don't know enough about how it now works out for these young people to be able to say with confidence that it remains the right thing for as many cases as we see.
Now at the Court of Appeal, he thinks it's time to look at alternatives to adoption, including more involvement from the wider birth family or long-term fostering.
I felt it was time to ask the question, is it the right model? It will certainly be the right model for a lot of children and young people, but I query whether we know enough about how these more difficult, complicated cases play out over the years to know whether it is the right thing.
It's now almost 6 months since Jane and Keith sent their daughter back to care. It was the most difficult decision of their lives. But they say, ironically, it's only now that she's left the family home and gone under the care of the local authority that she's finally getting the support she needed.
Our daughter's now getting help from every side. She has a clinical psychologist, a one-to-one at school, she has her own social worker and a supervising social worker, and then there's the therapeutic foster carer, and the foster carer has a supervising social worker. Also, foster carers get 4 weeks respite a year. We didn't get that. She has wraparound care now, so the resources are clearly there, but when we asked for it, there was practically nothing. She was a toddler when she came to us. She's 10 now. I just feel like we lost 7 years of our life through adoption.
Elsewhere, Patrick's parents say they've been on the brink of adoption breakdown for almost 3 years. The impact it's had on their lives is huge.
There needs to be more of a partnership approach between the parents and the services. Like foster carers work with the professionals. Local authorities talk about putting children at the centre, but it is all talk. It's completely misleading and so far from reality from our perspective. Every discussion and every subsequent decision is financially driven. This isn't the way to safeguard the future of some of the most vulnerable children in our society.
Back in London, like many adoptive families, Elaine and Jenny are battling on.
Oh, is this her here?
That's it, yeah. She's just eating cereals with her feet in the drawer and just laughing. I know we always laugh in photos anyway, but there's me and her laughing.
Elaine is keen to look forward, so she sellotaped photographs from happy times to the fridge door.
I just thought it'd be good to do some positives and try and just to realise that the life hasn't all been bad, and that we've got a good foundation really, and that trying to get hold of the foundations again and trying to do, move forward and have a good future.
Jenny is now at college and she's back, for the most part, at home with Mum. She said she got tired of running.
It got to a point where I just, like the police, they said this is your, I was getting onto my last warnings. Then they said, carry on going, you're going to be put into a secure unit and you're going to be locked away. I felt, you know what, that's not the life and that's not the way I want to go. I need to change it.
But Mum Elaine still worries about what's to come.
Isn't really so much about what she does to us. It's about her future and her going out in the world and fighting other people and meeting the wrong people in the street. It's her future we're talking about with the violence. It's about her ending up in very dangerous places with very dangerous people if she can't control herself.
Adoption can transform lives. It provides stable, loving homes to some of the most vulnerable kids in society. But it's not always easy. And families in crisis say it's vital they get the help they need to stay together.
That's your number one fan over there.
She is, who's my number one fan? Simon Cowell? No, he's not. It's the person that's building me up and helping me and supporting me through it.
But sometimes, through the cracks, light gets in.
Just thank you for what you did that she didn't, and she was meant to do it and you didn't have to do it and you did. And thank you, really. That's it, really, isn't it? And I have started to appreciate you more because I let my anger out on you, but you were the person that I loved the most, and that's why I did take it out on you, innit? Because, I'm saying, your family's your family. And yeah, that's why things got tough. But, yeah. That's it, really.
Thank you.
Sweet, mate.
This programme was produced in Salford by Jane Drinkwater. The reporter was Ailiss Hart. If you've been affected by any of the issues raised in the programme, then you can find organisations that can help by visiting bbc.co.uk/actionline.